Non-metallic metals. The act of painting a surface to make it look like it's made of metal without using any strictly metallic paints. This is a subject I've been wanting to cover for quite a while now, but I just keep putting it off, thinking I'm not good enough or that it's something better left to competition level painters. But you know what? I've been using non-metallic metals for several years now, and I no longer think it's that complicated to explain. So this week, we're going to be painting up the Kuroshi Rider by this video's sponsor, Infinity, using a non-metallic metal style, and I'm going to do my best to explain every step along the way. To start out, I assembled the figure and did a quick bit of miniature photography. Now, I don't usually do this when painting non-metallic metals, I just usually wing it, but I think we have a unique opportunity here today as the figure itself is made out of metal. So shining a light down on the figure from directly above, we can get a really good look at where the highlights and shadows would be if this were a life-size metal bike. Well, more or less. Size does affect shadows slightly, but we can get a good idea of where to start from this, and we can have this image open above our workspace to reference as we paint. And basically, we can take a few lessons from this. Lesson number 1, our highest highlights are not necessarily at the highest points of the model, but instead they are in the areas most perpendicular to the light source. The more vertical the surface becomes, the more shadow we get. And when the surface finally crosses that threshold of being more than 90 degrees from flat, that's when we get a hard shadow. You'll notice at these axes where the surface turns on more than a 90-degree angle, we get this sort of hard shadow band. And aside from the deepest crevices on the model and the drop shadow beneath the model, it's these shadow bands that are the darkest points, and you'll notice they slowly fade into less dark areas. This is because the ground reflects light back up onto the figure as well. To exaggerate this, let's use a mirrored surface to maximize the amount of bounce light that we're getting on the underside of the model. The areas very far down on the model aren't always the darkest points. Instead, it's the areas where the surfaces cross that line between horizontal and vertical, as well as, of course, the deep crevices. So with all this in mind, let's start painting the bike. But before we do this, I want to add a little bit of basing details to make it look like she's cruising down a futuristic road of some sorts. So in order to drive this point home, I used some textured polystyrene to create a sort of tiled sidewalk, as well as a zip tie with the textured side facing downwards to create a curb on the sidewalk. I then thought the road side of the base might be a bit too plain, so I added just a bit of textured foil and plastic from a pill container to create a batch of textured metal on the road. And once all of this stuff was glued down to the base with Gorilla Super Glue gel and it was fully dry, I carefully trimmed off the excess with some hobby clippers and a hobby knife. And with this complete, I think it really does help the base look like a road and a sidewalk, and I think it accents the figure pretty well. But this is a sci-fi city, so I thought I'd add some florist wire to show some cabling laid across the sidewalk, and I also laid down a few little extra round plastic bits from a Dungeons & Lasers tile kit sprue that I had lying around. I cut these down to 2 different heights to add a bit of visual interest to the sidewalk, and that's pretty much it. With our base complete, I glued the figure down to the base and got straight to priming. And while we could start with any kind of primer, an argument could be made for starting with a zenithal prime, for instance, I think the best way to start something like this is just a plain black prime, so we don't have to rely on using any washes to darken the deep crevices later on. And with the model primed in black, I started blocking in the main areas of light on the bike using our lighting footage for reference. And to begin, I started with just these 2 colors, dark warm gray and bright warm gray from the Pro Acryl line of paints, which for the rest of this video I will simply be referring to as light gray and dark gray. These paints are naturally quite thin, so I find they are really ideal for painting models that require a lot of blending, a lot of layers. And I actually like to use these on just a regular palette, not a wet palette, as I find a wet palette thins them down even further than is necessary for my liking. So with these two paints on our palette, you can see I'm sort of blending them together on the palette to get a color value right in between the two. And I'm using this on the model to block in all of the areas that we know are going to be hit by light, once again using our footage for reference. I'm using a fairly large brush here and just going through blocking things in fast and loose. This might seem like the most intimidating phase, as it's going to be the phase where the model looks quite ugly at first, but just stick with it. Painting non-metallic metals is kind of like putting together a jigsaw puzzle. You start by blocking in all the easy parts, the edge pieces, if you will, but for the middle sections, you often just have to make some guesses. Try some pieces out, see if they fit, and if they don't, just try again, try something different. Consult your reference material for clues, and then make a different guess. That's part of the reason we're using such thin paints for this process, so that you can make as many guesses as you want before nailing down exactly what that area should look like. And with a few of our main areas blocked in, you can see I'm now starting to go through and adding some brighter highlights using just our light gray color. For this, I'm using more of a scrambling motion. For those of you who aren't familiar with the channel, and what I mean by that, I'm just using a heavy dry brush, but in a very specific, very targeted way. You can see I'm using the texture of the model to my advantage here, wiping the paint onto the model in patterns that I'm seeing in the reference material, exaggerating them slightly in places, and letting the dark shadows stay in the recesses. Next up, we're going to do some blending, using a thinned down version of our mid-tone gray, adding slightly more dark gray into the mix, but not going full dark gray quite yet, to blend out the mid-tone highlights gradually and softly into the areas of darkness. This sort of blending probably requires the most practice of any parts of this process, but it's one of those things that you'll get better at the more you practice, and this kind of skill, the more you practice it, it's going to make you better at all kinds of painting. By understanding the principles of non-metallic metals, you're really just learning to be a better painter overall. And for the rest of this, all I'm doing here is just looking at the reference and trying to replicate it on the model, adding highlights, shadows, adjusting things as necessary, and exaggerating in some areas where it makes sense. Remember that in general, horizontal surfaces will reflect more light, vertical surfaces will have more shadow, and when in doubt, just edge highlight, as edges almost always tend to look good with those bright rims, even if it's always not technically correct. This can be a long and tedious process sometimes, but I also find is extremely satisfying when you start to see things coming together. And when you find you're in doubt about where to put the highlight and the shadow on something, a great fallback is to think of it like water running off a cliff. The light pools at the edge of the cliff. It's darkest right underneath the cliff edge as the cliff goes vertical, and it slowly gets brighter as you move down the cliff's surface. The steeper the cliff's angle, the darker the shadow underneath. For more rounded surfaces, I often find it's a bit harder to determine where exactly the lights and shadows should go, but that's why we have reference material. As you do this more and more, you'll start to get the hang of it and have a sort of instinct for where the highlights go on these more complicated shapes. But for practice, I find vehicles like this with lots of really strongly defined angles and large planes is a great place to start for non-metallic metals. Especially when compared to something like, let's say, metal armor or weapons, which can be a lot easier to cheat a non-metallic metal effect with. You can use a lot of tricks to get a cool look on armor and more complicated shapes, but at the same time, you aren't learning as much about how light actually moves and performs when you use these sorts of tricks. Okay, so at this point, I was starting to feel like the bike itself was starting to look pretty good. Not perfect, it still needs some adjustments, but I took a break from painting the bike here to start painting the rider. Now, notably, I didn't take any reference footage of the rider before she was primed, so this is going to be pure guesswork on my part, but I am going to be using educated guesswork, as we're going to apply the same principles here that we used for the rest of the bike. I started by applying dark gray to the entire scythe, leaving black in the crevices, and then did the same thing with all of the armor plates on her suit, her helmet, as well as on the part that I think is supposed to be a prosthetic arm. After this, I started applying edge highlights onto any parts of the armor where I thought the light might catch, using a very dry brush, wiping off the excess, and just letting the edge of the brush catch on all of those details. Also around this point, I realized that the interior of one side of the back tire should also have a metal surface, so I quickly went in and painted that in our same metal treatment as well. And with this complete, it's time to drop the training weights, as it were, and allow ourselves to do some really dark shadows and really bright highlights to finish off the non-metallic metal look. To do this, I added some coal black to our palette, and by mixing this with our dark gray, we can really expand the range of our shadows. You can see what I'm doing here is I've mixed a little bit of black with our dark gray to emphasize existing shadows. You can see in some areas where I want a more gradual highlight, I dab on some of this darker gray, clean my brush, and then use a just plain wet brush to blend it outwards. I like to use only dark gray as my darkest shadow at first and paint as much as I can without resorting to using the darkest black at first, and then at the end we can sort of expand the range and it feels really powerful, I find, to be able to add back in these extreme dark shadows at the end. And I'm also using pure black at this point to go in and correct any mistakes I may have made, outlining any areas in pure black and just cleaning things up. And also just defining stronger shapes by using a mixture of black and dark gray. This refining stage is probably one of my favorite parts of the entire process, as I feel like you can really see the whole piece start to come together at this stage. After this, we can then do the same thing with an even brighter white, boosting all of our highlights to an even brighter range. I'm mostly edge highlighting here with the side of my brush, but I'm also doing some more subtle blending in places where necessary. And yeah, that's pretty much the main method that I use to achieve non-metallic metal, silver, or steel. You can substitute in whatever other colors you might like if you want other colors of metal such as gold, bronze, or even other colors outside of that. It's all pretty much the same method, and it's really just a matter of practicing your ability to paint light sources falling over shiny surfaces. However, you might have noticed this model does look a little bit boring in just black, white, and gray. So let's finish up the model by painting both the base as well as adding in some colored accent lighting. To start out, I base coated all the areas on the base that would be made out of concrete or tile using a mix of dark and light gray. I used just the edge of my brush for this to leave all the crevices a nice dark black, and for the metal plate on the road, I just dry brushed it using a light gray. Once this was done, I glued the model down to the base using super glue, posing her in a dynamic way, giving her a little bit of a tilt to the left. And I think she looks good, she looks okay, but you know what would make her look even better? Some dynamic colored lighting. I think there could be some fluorescent lighting just off screen that's reflecting off the metal of the bike and her armor, and in order to represent this, we're going to use a few colors of Vallejo game color fluorescence. For the lights that are actually on the bike, I used fluorescent red, and then for the light coming down from the top and the right side, I reasoned we might get some bright blue light, so I used fluorescent blue for this. These paints are naturally quite thin and transparent, so they work super well for adding these OSL effects. And honestly, if you wanted the bike to be reflecting a bright blue sky, I think this would be a good step to take as well. I'm just taking my time with this, glazing the blue paint on very thin, using water to dilute it when necessary, and hitting any of the parts of the model that I think might be hit by this blue light. After this, I thought it would be cool to have a colored bounce light coming off the ground as well, reflecting up from the surface of the road onto the bottom of the bike. So for this, I used fluorescent magenta. And again, same technique here as before. I just applied this color in a super thin way, hitting any parts of the model that might logically be lit from below. And then I reasoned that if this was the case, the entire pavement should also have a bit of this color. So I applied a thinned down glaze of magenta to the concrete and the floor as well. I continued working this paint over the model for a while, blending out some more magenta and some more blue over the surface, very subtly, very patiently. I added a wash of blue over the tiles and wet blended it with some of the magenta, as you'd probably see the light bouncing off of those areas as well. And yeah, you can add as little or as much of these fluorescent glazes as you want. It's really just a matter of taste if you like this sort of thing. But in general, I find that adding these sorts of extra light sources can help add interest and mood to the model, but also help distract the eye from any areas where the non-metallic metals aren't quite blended perfectly. I spent quite a while adding these glazes before adding some light gray highlights back in where I went too far or wanted higher highlights. I added blue back on top of these highlights to blend them back down into each other and so forth until I got a look that I liked. And yeah, that's basically it. I could probably keep blending this model and adding little light sources to it forever, but we have to stop somewhere. So this is where we're gonna call it for today. Let me know down in the comments if you have any other questions about how I painted this model, and I'll do my best to answer as many of those as I can. And before we go, I'd like to thank Corvus Belli, the makers of the game Infinity, for sponsoring this video. I provided links to their website down in the description, and as always, thank you to all of our wonderful patrons over at patreon.com/DanaHowl for your constant support of the channel. I really appreciate it. And with that, thank you so much for watching, and I will see you in the next video.